Hello, everyone. This recording is basically for anyone who's not able to make class or who was in class and wanted to review some of the conversations we had during our first class. And so we want to begin by welcoming each of you to the class. I'm glad to have the opportunity to have you here in Core 113. And to begin, we want to make sure we establish familiarity and a good line of communication. And one of the things as we begin to look at the syllabus for the course, I'm going to take a little time to do that today. One of the things we want to understand is the best way to communicate with me as your instructor is through text or calling my phone number. You can email me, that's fine. I travel a lot, and so I won't always be able to respond right away to email. So if it's something that you need a quick answer to, or if you just need access to me, I have no problem with you texting me. I have no problem with you calling me. If I can't pick up the phone call, I will just let it go to voicemail, and then I will call you back as soon as I can. So there's no way you'll call me and it'll be a problem to me. As you can see from this first slide, my number is 814-502-8008. And so to get us in connection with each other and to help me to learn your names, I would like you to please, if you weren't in class, text me your name, the hometown that you're from, the major that you are studying, the area of study at St. Francis, some sort of interest or hobby of yours, and then a picture of yourself, preferably one that I can see your face clearly. And if you could please just take a minute, pause the video, and text those things to me at 814-502-8008. So I'll introduce myself to you. My name is Kevin DeLapp. My hometown is Altoona. I have lived here for most of my life. I lived about 10 years in Belleville, Pennsylvania. Came back here to Altoona about 7 years ago. My major in college was history. Then I went to grad school and studied history some more. And I've also studied a little bit of business along the way. And I have studied some American and British literature as well. My area of interest, I'm interested in a lot of different things. I run a ministry called Backyard Ministries, which works with families that live in public housing neighborhoods. I've done that for the last 8 years full time. And before that, I did it part time. I also do some things on Facebook. I have a Facebook page that I created over the break called Christians for Humility in Public Discourse, which endeavors to enter into conversations about society, about social and political issues in a way that's honoring to the Christian humility that's taught in the Bible, in a way that speaks justly and mercifully about things that are often difficult to talk about. So there we talk about things like race issues, we talk about immigration issues, we talk about politics and government. Also teach government at St. Francis as well, so I have interest there. And I'm also a Steelers fan, and I've been a Steelers fan my whole life. I'm recording this Sunday afternoon. The playoff game is tonight, so we'll see how that turns out with the game against Kansas City. But yeah, so that's some interest that I have. So this course is a Core 113 section. It's a section of Core 113. And the Core 113s have their own rationale to them. They have a kind of set way of doing things, and so much of the way the course is structured is according to that rationale. To have a section of Core 113, your course has to be interdisciplinary, has to have an ethical or value component to it, and it has to be very, very, it has to emphasize learning communication skills. And so we'll definitely be doing those things in this course. So some of the reading and writing things that we do in this course are scripted by St. Francis. There's a certain amount of writing and reading that has to be done. And so we work within those structures as best we can. The objectives of the course are really to accomplish three things. We want you to be able to find stuff, find information. We want you to learn how to think about the information that you find. And lastly, we want you to be able to learn how to communicate that information, specifically to be able to communicate your thoughts in writing. And so we're going to work real hard together. And I want you to understand that my part in all of this is to come alongside of you. I want you to succeed. I'm not the kind of teacher that is interested in proving how much I know and how little you know. Many of you will know things that I don't know anything about in some of the conversations that we'll have. What I want to do is share what I know with you and to help you to learn and grow and improve. And so I hope in all three of these areas, by the time we're done with this course, that you can honestly say that Mr. DeLapp helped me to learn how to find information, to learn how to better think about the information that I find, and to learn how to communicate my thoughts better, specifically in writing. The description of the course, so the course is named American Christianity and Race. So we're going to look at Christianity and race and the interaction of those two things within the context of America, within the context of the United States. And in doing that, obviously, there are multiple races that we could focus on. We could try to talk about all the races represented here in America, and we're not going to do that. We are going to try to make sure that all of the various races enter into our conversation at one point or another, but we are going to focus on particularly the experience of Black Americans. And we're going to look at that through four eras in American history. We're going to look at the slavery era, which is basically 1619 to about 1865 and the end of the Civil War. Then we're going to look at the Jim Crow era, which is 1865 till about the 1950s. We're going to look at the era of civil rights from the 50s to about 1968. And we're going to look at the post-civil rights era, which is the era that we're living in now. That is from 1968 till the present. As we do that, again, in each of those eras, we will try to bring in relevant information about other groups other than Black Americans and their experience in American history. But our focus and our lens will be the experience of Black Americans. The assignments that you're expected to do within this conversation that we're going to have are pretty simple, pretty straightforward. For each week of class, you're going to have readings that you have to do and discussion posts that you have to do. Now, typically, what you will do is you'll have a reading assigned for Tuesday, and you'll have to do that reading before class, and you'll have to post answers to the discussion associated with that reading and with the module for that week, for that day. And so you'll see that today has a module associated with it, and that's module 1.1. And if you look in the syllabus, you can see that in the syllabus outline. And on Canvas, you will see posted there the course syllabus, the MLA formatting and style guide, the first discussion, the notes associated with today's conversation, a video lecture that goes into some deeper history of conversations, and then the teaching slides that I will use in class. For this particular day, then there'll also be the video that you are using today, which describes everything and has the recording of me talking about this information. So each Tuesday, typically you have readings and discussion posts that are due, and that part of the class is worth 40% of your final grade, how you do on those readings. Now, typically, you'll post for Tuesday, and you have to post before class starts. Once class starts, you can't post while I'm teaching, and you can't post after class. You have to post before class. And There's very specific requirements with regard to the posts. Most of the posts say very clearly that you can only put one sentence in there. There's a reason for that, and I'll talk more about that as we go forward. But they're very specific. You follow the directions. I will then come in after class on Tuesday, and I will grade your post, and I will put up an audio comment that explains why you got the grade that you did and how you can improve. And then typically what you'll do is between Tuesday and Thursday, you will revise your post, and then I will grade it again based on your revision. And usually on Thursday, there's one more question that's new on that module. This week it's module 1, 2, and usually there's revisions of old stuff and then maybe one new question. And then there'll be a grade for the Thursday post as well. This week's a little different because you obviously couldn't post yet for our first class. And so you'll be posting sometime later today. I'll explain that in a second. Then on Thursday, there's this unique post this week, and there may be a revision, I'm not sure, but you just go in there and see the directions, okay? So that's the first part of the class, is your preparation for class. And then secondly, there is the requirement of coming to class. And in Core 113s, your attendance in class is huge. It's very important. Your attendance here and your participation here. And that means essentially following along with the conversation, using your computer to follow along on Canvas or to take notes for what we are doing in class, and absolutely nothing else. And then also on top of that, there's 5 library seminars that need to be accomplished. 4 of them are accomplished in class, and 1 is accomplished online. And then you must attend 1 CES event during the course of the semester and notify me that you accomplished that. And so altogether, those things make up 20% of your grade. And then the last thing is you will write 2 major research papers, and they are 20% each or 40% together. And essentially, basically, I'm going to walk you through the process of learning how to get the information you need to write a good paper, to think about it, and to present it in the correct way. And we will talk about that in much greater detail as we go forward together. Some of that information will come along as we go through the different class periods. But for now, there's 2 research papers, and basically you write a paper, we will grade it, we will talk about it, we will meet and talk about your paper, and then you will essentially revise the paper. Your second paper is a revision of your first paper. So the last thing about the course that's real important to understand is academic honesty and accommodations. Academic honesty is critical. You must read the academic honesty policy that St. Francis puts out. It's in our syllabus. And you must understand clearly all of the things associated with that. You must understand that being academically dishonest will result in the grade of F. And I don't want to do that to any student, so please don't be academically dishonest. And so we're going to talk a lot about that in this class as well. And then accommodations. If you have any need of any help or assistance or accommodations in any way, that's what I'm here to do. And want to make sure that you have all the information you need, and if there's anything in particular that you need help with regard to accommodations, please feel free to contact me and we'll figure it out. So today we want to begin our conversation. We're going to learn a couple tools. We're going to learn a particular tool, and we're going to talk in general, kind of to set up our conversation about race in America, about American Christianity and race, and trying to understand from the Christian perspective what race relations looks like in America, and how Christians have responded, to issues of race throughout our history. First of all, we need to know what is the racial breakdown in America. In 2019, the census put out this information on how America breaks down. The census said that America is 76.3% of Americans identify as white. Now, within that 76.3%, about 18.5% of those people also identify as Hispanic and Latino, which means that that carves down the people that only identify as white alone, not Hispanic or Latino, are actually now closer to about 58% of Americans identify that way. So that 76.3% number includes some Hispanic and Latino folks, or it includes the Hispanic and Latino population. 13.4% of Americans identify as Black. 5.9% of Americans identify as Asian. 2.8% of Americans identify as two or more races. 1.3% of Americans identify as American Indian or Alaskan Native, and 0.2% of Americans identify as Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. So if you look at this list, first of all, you understand these are the designations that the census uses to categorize people by race. So we're going to use these same words working within that definition. Should also note that it's important in this class for us to work real hard at understanding what words are acceptable and unacceptable when talking about race, because there have been times in our history when a word was acceptable at one time in our history and then over time became unacceptable. And so if you're ever wondering what's acceptable, these words are acceptable, okay? And so if you have a word that you're thinking, should I, because you may have heard a word within your family, and you may assume that that word's being used without any malice, without any sort of racist intention, but today it might be taken that way. So if you have a question about a word, then refer that to me, and we'll figure out whether that word is an appropriate word to use today in talking about a race. But if you look at this list, a couple things we'll note. First of all, white Americans are the majority. If just white only is about 58% of Americans, that's a majority by themselves. Hispanic and Latino folks are about an 18.5% minority. Understand that's an ethnic, not racial minority, because Hispanic and Latino folks would be identifying as white, but from a different ethnic background. And if you understand the difference between racial designations and ethnic designations, racial designations are based in physical characteristics, in particular in skin color. Also, obviously, other racial characteristics involve hair texture, bone structure, things like that. But it is race is a predominantly physical designation. Ethnicity has to do with things like what language you speak, your cultural traditions, where you're from. So I'm going to talk in a second about I have some connection to Italian ethnicity. That's an ethnicity. People that came from Italy or connected to people that came from Italy, spoke Italian, have certain characteristics or cultural characteristics, and none of those have anything to do with physical things, driven by physical things. Now, people, because they come from a certain ethnic background, might have physical similarities, but ethnicity is not driven by that, okay? And so then, as you look at this list, one thing that would really jump out to you is each group has its own unique experience. Obviously, white folks have one experience coming here to America, and white folks are going to incorporate it into them a whole bunch of ethnic experience. Germans, English, Italian, Eastern Europeans, Russians, Scot, Irish, French. There's a whole bunch of different groups that are going to blend into that designation of white. Hispanics or Latinos. have their own unique history in America. Black Americans have their own unique history. Asian Americans have their own unique history. People of mixed race have their own history. American Indians, Native Hawaiians have their own history. And what you can look at when you see this is that each of these groups, in one way or another, experienced some kind of discrimination in different degrees, different experiences from all of these groups, but in different degrees. But each has its own unique story and heritage, both positive and negative, both in being treated in a negative way, but also this wonderful story of overcoming obstacles, of being able to come here to America and establish themselves as individuals and as groups. And so there's a beautiful aspect of this. There's the difficulty of it. And I think one of the things this course is going to try to attempt to understand is that there's always good and bad surrounding us. And the Bible teaches us that. It's very clear about that the world is a place where there are good and bad elements existing at all times. And so as we think about what that looks like in our population by race and by ethnicity, obviously there's lots of negativity there. But there's also beauty. There's the beautiful aspect of our diversity. And so as we talk about race and as we talk about ethnicity, we want to understand that this is the world we live in. This is who we are as people. And it is a beautiful, beautiful thing. And so we want to learn in this class to talk openly and to celebrate who we are. And we also want to learn to celebrate who other people are and to learn to figure out what the difficulties are, what the problems have been, try to address them, and try to understand how to think about them and how to communicate our ideas about how to move forward. But at the same time, we always have to remember there's a positive story here and there's a negative story, and we're going to understand and try to learn how to work within both contexts. So to try to understand that, I'm going to share with you my racial and ethnic identity. And we're also going to learn, as I do that, how to use our first technique, our first writing technique, which is how to use a colon to create a list. And so I have written a very long sentence here that describes my own personal racial and ethnic identity. And you're going to go after class today, or after you're done with this video, and you're going to do the same thing. You're going to use this sentence that I've created as a template, and we're just going to practice using this particular tool. So my racial and ethnic identity looks like this. I identify racially and ethnically as white and part Italian. And I put a colon there. The colon is the two dots above each other. My mother was white and a mixture of English and German. My mother's parents were white and a mixture of English and German. My father is white and half or 50% Italian. My father's mom was white and a mixture of English and German. My father's dad was white and 100% Italian. So you see in my racial and ethnic heritage, it's a whole bunch of white people from ethnically a whole bunch of different places. And when I say folks were English and German, it's muddled. My grandparents, if you go through, and my mom, if you go through their history, and my dad's mom, it's complex. And there could be some Scot and German and Eastern European in there as well, or Scot and Irish in there, and maybe some Eastern European. There's a broad mixture there, but I think predominantly English and German as far as we know. But there's a tremendous mix of ethnicity there in a number of my ancestors. My dad is the person that has the strongest ethnic association, but oddly enough, it is to a part of our family that we have no connection with. So my dad, his father was 100% Italian. His mother was a mix of German and English. But my dad was taken away from his parents, the DeLaps, when he was, I believe, 6 years old, and he was put in a foster home and raised with foster parents. And so I have these foster family that actually I called my grandparents. they aren't on this list because they're not biologically related to me, but they are actually my grandparents as far as I view them. These folks that I'm talking about are my ancestral grandparents, but I didn't know them at all. My dad's dad, um, his dad, or my dad's grandfather, was Andrea Delap, and he and his wife Raffaella, again both full-blooded Italian, came across on a ship from Italy. I believe Andrea came in 1911 to America as an Italian immigrant, and his wife came along with their oldest son the next year, and then they had four more children, and one of those children was my dad's father. So my dad, and I think this is a very interesting place to start this conversation. My dad has always identified as Italian. If you'd ask him, about his ethnic identity, he would say, well, he's Italian. Well, he's only half Italian. And he doesn't know any Italians. Like he wasn't connected to any of that family. He wasn't raised by that family. Um, Never really associated with them until a few years ago when my dad was in the hospital and one of his cousins happened to be in the hospital on the same floor getting the same operation done that day. And so we met, and I've kind of become associated with the family now. But for much of his life, he had no connection. But he'd always make that identity, and I make the identity as well. Because the truth is, and I've joked about this, if I don't make that, I'm 25% Italian. If I don't make that part Italian identity, um, then I would call myself just white because I really have no identity whatsoever. And that's a real experience in America among white folks that come here and mix together over generations from different ethnicities. And after a while, you're really just white. That's your only identity. You don't really have an ethnic identity anymore, except to say you are American. But that's kind of an odd thing in America when you have so many different groups that have such a distinctive identity. And so that's a unique thing. And so, yeah, so that's interesting for me. And I've often found, so talking about this, it's important to understand that people have a need for identity. They have a need to develop an identity. And this isn't the only way we can identify, obviously, but it's one way that we can identify, and it's an important way for people. So that's my identity. So what you're going to do tonight or after class today is you're going to go in and you're going to write a sentence. You're going to introduce yourself to the class in one sentence, and you're going to write one of these sentences. And you're going to try to do it exactly the way I did it, but with your own information. All right? And I want you to notice why my sentence works. First of all, the colon is critical. Notice down here below I have some explanation of how this works. The first statement is the clause before the colon must be independent. To use a colon to create a list, as I have, which is a wonderful tool, what comes before the colon must be an independent clause. It must be a complete sentence. In other words, you must be able to replace that colon with a period and read that thing, and it must make sense. So mine says, I identify racially and ethnically as white and part Italian. That's a complete sentence. It's everything it needs. If that was just a sentence with a period, that would be okay. You cannot put part of a sentence in the front part, then put a colon, and then put the rest. That is incorrect. Okay? So let me show you three common ways that people do this. The first way is they separate the noun from its verb. So if I would have written my racial and ethnic identity, colon, is white and part Italian. What I've done is I've taken the noun of the sentence, which is my racial and ethnic identity, and I've separated it from the verb, which is the word is. You can't do that. Okay? That's the first way that people can mess this up. The second way people mess it up is by separating the verb from its object. So my racial and ethnic identity is, colon, and then you start to write the things on your list. That separates the verb from its object and creates, again, an incomplete sentence on the front end, and you can't do that. All right? That's not correct. And then thirdly, the colon shouldn't separate a preposition from its object. In this case, if I'd have written, I identify racially and ethnically as, and then put a colon, as is a preposition, white and part Italian are the nouns that go with the preposition. You can't do that. Again, and if you notice all three of these sentences that I wrote that are incorrect, what comes after the colon is necessary to finish the first part of the sentence, and you can't do that. Notice again what I wrote. Identify racially and ethnically as white and part Italian. That stands alone. And then the beauty of that, you put that colon in there, and then that colon signifies I'm going to describe what I just said. I'm going to elaborate on what I just said. You could put a single dependent clause in there to elaborate on what I just said, or you can go as you can put multiple things separated by commas, as I have, and those multiple things can be something like one word each, but they can also be phrases or actually almost entire sentences. So in this case, my mother was white, and a mixture of English and German is actually a sentence. My mother's parents were white, and a mixture of English and German. My father is white and 50% Italian. So the beauty of this tool is if you have something you want to say, and you want to, and you're writing your research paper, or you're writing a discussion post, and you have one sentence that you can get this accomplished in, and you want to wrap it all together, and you want to say, here's, there are several reasons why, blah, blah, blah. Put that colon in, and you can list the reasons in complete sentence form if you want, separated by commas with an and before the last part of your list. Put a period at the end, and it's all complete and accurate. It's a wonderful tool, and it's a very impressive tool for you to be able to use. When a teacher sees this and used properly, it's impressive. And so we want you to be able to use this. So you're going to practice it by doing your own racial and ethnic identity profile based on how you think and see. Now, you don't have to use, again, use the writing as a template. You might not have a particular identity as far as ethnicity. You may have only a racial identity, or you might identify differently than me, or you might think it doesn't have to be, you might identify as mixed race, or you might identify with another way of shaping that. That you own that. You don't have to use my words, but you do have to use my structure. Okay? So now we're going to dive into a conversation, really some simple, basic, foundational things that we want to understand about what we're going to be talking about in this class. So I spent a few minutes talking about the beauty of race and the beauty of diversity, and really learning to see that as we identify and see the significance and the importance of the identities and our heritage and the connection to it, and being able to tell our stories and what we've overcome, etc. But in the mix of all of that, there's that negative side. And we know that. And we know that as people and as Christians, we live in a world where people often struggle to identify themselves in a healthy way and to treat people who identify differently from them in a healthy way. Now, obviously, the Bible comes against that in a very, very aggressive way. And so the really tough aspect of all of this is what we call racism. And we want to start by having a very clear understanding of racism and how we would define it. And so racism itself rests on two basic premises. The first is the idea that race determines individual character traits and capacities. Things like a person's honesty, integrity, courage, responsibility, discipline, work ethic, etc. That physical characteristics, that the color of a person's skin determines what kind of job they're able to do, what kind of parents they'll be, what kind of abilities they're going to have, and their character, whether they'll be trustworthy or not. That is the essence of racism. And we have to understand that as we start to think about this subject for our class. Racism can exist without hatred. Certainly, these things can be thought in hatred, but you can not hate somebody and be a racist. And that's important to understand. Some people think that racism is just hatred. Some people think racism is just hurting somebody or treating somebody bad. And you can be a racist and believe all the things that I just listed there and not hurt anybody. You can treat everybody great. You could be a kind, actually loving, decent person and be a racist. You can look like all of those things and still be in your thinking a racist. So we have to understand race determines individual character traits and capacities. That's the essence of racism. The second thing we need to understand is that racism takes from the first thing and comes to the conclusion that these differing character traits of the races produce inherent racial superiority or inferiority. And I think I would focus on superiority. Um, the idea that my group is better than your group is really an essential element of racism. And again, why are we different? Because of our physical characteristics and because they're more than physical. Because we think they are, a racist thinks that those physical characteristics determine character and capacity. And so because of that, because we have these different character and capacity traits, then the races are not equal to each other. That this creates racial superiority and therefore inferiority. Now, this racism, as we have defined it, can manifest itself in two different ways. Some people see it as a manifestation primarily by individual action. Other people say that it is systemic, that racism can exist within a system. What we mean by that is, for example, in America, slavery was part of our Constitution. And so within our system, there was the protection of slavery. And so racism, this racist ideology, was written into our Constitution. It ended up being written into our Supreme Court decisions throughout the years on multiple times through much of our history. And so we need to understand that. Some people deny that there's any systemic racism. They say it's only can be individual. Some people believe that it is both. So you either believe that it's individual, both, or both. But yeah, so that's an important understanding of how it can manifest itself. Secondly, racism we need to understand is adaptive. As we look at the four periods in American history that we're going to study, it's very fascinating to look at. During the slavery era, when white Americans owned Africans as their slaves, the argument that white Americans made was that this is practical, um, that um, that the characteristics, these characteristics that people have by determined by their race, or that the race determines, made Africans just better at working in the cotton fields, for example, and it made white people better at managing the plantation. This is just practical use of people's gifts and abilities. After slavery ended and everybody's free, the argument shifted to a much more heavy emphasis on racial purity and the importances of the races not mixing. Now we know that in the slavery era there was lots of racial mixing because white owners sexually exploited their female slaves. And there were lots of mixed race children born as a result. But when we get past that and we get to the era of Jim Crow and segregation, we actually divide up into two different societies because white Americans start arguing that the races need to remain pure to preserve that hierarchy of races, and that racial mixing is the worst thing that could happen. And so the argument of the racist of the Jim Crow era is purity, racial purity, and segregation. And then in the civil rights era, in the 50s and 60s, there are racists that argue, hey, we don't believe in these things anymore. But to Martin Luther King, they would say, slow down, be patient, don't go out into the streets and protest. This will all take care of itself, but just be patient. And so those racists, there could be non-racists making that argument, but there are a lot of racists that made the argument as well because they wanted to preserve the inequality that existed. And so the best way to do that at that moment was to say, well, we don't believe in these racist ideas anymore, but we want to keep the system the way it is. So just be patient and it'll all go away. And then today we live in a very fascinating time since the civil rights movement, which corrected some of the structural issues that existed, and gave Black Americans the right to legally argue against or legally defend themselves against discrimination. But now we have a period that we would call the racist argument of denialism exists, where there's a lot of people out there who are racist who are saying there's no problem anymore. There's no problem. Racism doesn't exist in America anymore. And the only problem is people are to keep talking about it. And if we just stop talking about it, we would we'd all get along fine and there'd be no issue. But it's obviously more complicated than that for anybody that studies the issue. And as a result, some people making this argument may like the fact that, for example, the jails get filled up with Black Americans much more so than white Americans. Much greater numbers of Black Americans are poorer than white Americans, and they look at that and they say, "Well, that's not our problem. We need to stop talking about race," and they just deny the existence of a problem. There can be people that are not racist that make that argument as well. That's what you have to understand. Both things can exist. You can have racists making the argument because they want to preserve the system and the inequalities that exist. Or you can have non-racists making the argument because they legitimately think that there's not a problem. And the same way as the patient's argument of the civil rights era could be made by a racist or a non-racist. But the point for us now is that it's adaptive. There's no question that racism adapts to different situations. Again, understanding what it is, the idea that physical characteristics determine character traits and capacities, and that they therefore produce these differing character traits produce inherent racial superiority or inferiority. So we want to talk for a minute then about the idea of living in a racialized society. So the question for us is America today in the post-civil rights era a racialized society? Here's what the characteristics of a racialized society are. Now I want you to think about this. First of all, people identify themselves by race and are constantly aware of the race of others. Is that the kind of society that we live in? Secondly, racial separation is normal and racial mixing is limited. Third, people encounter differing life experiences and opportunities based on their race. Fourth, racial inequality is the norm. And fifth, racially neutral actions can have the unintended result of contributing to racial division and inequality. So somebody can contribute to racial division and inequality by doing something that is actually not directly racist. And we'll talk more about that as the class progresses. But the question is, do we live in a racialized society? Is that the kind of society that we live in? Is race, are we aware of race? Is separation of races normal? Do people encounter different life experiences based on their race? Is there racial inequality? And can a racially neutral action have the unintended result of contributing to racial division and inequality? And then lastly today, I want to talk about critical race theory. So a very controversial thing today is what we call critical race theory. It's been around for about 50 to 60 years. And it's a set of ideas that attempts to look at America through the lens of racial injustice and inequality, and to come to terms with our history, our country, and our current experience. And it started actually as a legal issue where they tried to go through the legal system and figure out where racial inequality existed and get rid of it. All right. So what I have on this slide are two different things. I have critical race theory, and I have 5 statements that basically what critical race theorists say they are. And then in parentheses with each one, I have the way critical race theory is being represented. So understand there are people that believe in critical race theory, and there are people that are radically opposed to it. Within the group of people that believe in critical race theory, there are moderates, there are people that are a little less moderate, and there are people that are radical. All right. And so what we have in our culture today is we have a radical element in the opposition to critical race theory, essentially defining critical race theory by its most radical elements, or even elements that don't even exist within critical race theory. So understand that. What does that look like? So first of all, critical race theory basically says five, actually pretty simple things. The first is that racism is normal. That if you're a black person in America, you are going to probably encounter racism. That doesn't mean that you're going to encounter it every day. I'm sitting here making this recording and it's snowing outside. All right. I live in central Pennsylvania. Snow is normal here. All right. It doesn't happen every day. But I don't look outside and freak out and start screaming like if I was in Arizona and it was snowing. Well, it depends on mountains and stuff, but you understand what I'm saying. Uh, Snow is normal here. It doesn't freak me out, but it doesn't happen every day or every minute. That's not the only thing it does here, but it's normal. All right. That's what critical race theory says about racism. It's normal. People aren't surprised when somebody looks at them differently or makes a comment or responds in an odd way to a person based on their race. It's normal. The representation of CRT is the idea that everything is racist or all white people are racist. That's not actually what critical race theory says. Now, there are some radical CRT people out there that might say that or come close to saying this, but the reality is the mainstream of CRT doesn't say everything is racist. It doesn't say all white people are racist. They do say that it is a serious problem and it is in our world and we have to deal with it. All right. The second thing CRT says is racism is embedded in our system. The system of America, in our Constitution, in our legal system, in the way we structure things in this country, racism is embedded in there because of past decisions that have occurred by people who were racist. Now there are people that potentially are racist, but potentially aren't racist at all. They're still part of that system, and that system itself is still producing a racist result, an unequal result, because it's embedded. And we have to continue to look at it and try to understand how to deal with that reality. The representation of CRT is that it says everything in and about the United States system is racist. That's not the same thing. It's a different thing. Again, are there radicals within CRT that might say this? Maybe. But most CRT folks are not going to say that. They're going to recognize that there are some elements in the American system that aren't racist at all. Some elements that are completely neutral. But there are pieces of the American system that are racist. And that's what they're arguing. Thirdly, CRT argues that racism is usually removed from structures when the interests of the dominant group converge with the interest of the marginalized. So basically, that piece is saying that typically, when things get better, it's a result of the interest of the dominant group converging with the interest of the people that are being oppressed. So, for example, whenever Democrats argue that black people should be able to vote, okay, the interest convergence theory would say white Democrats are only arguing black people can vote because black people, 90% of them vote Democratic. And so there's an interest convergence there, okay? And so they would argue they're not doing it because they want to get rid of racism or they want people to be treated equally. They're doing it because their interests converge and it's good for them. And so, of course, there's some truth to that. Do people do things in their self-interest? Yeah. But the opposition or the representation of CRT would be to say that CRT says that these injustice is only removed when the interests converge. Only removed. And so that, and obviously I have a problem with that as a Christian because that takes away the element of somebody just doing the right thing and saying, look, I'm a Christian and I'm not going to think this way. So I'm going to remove this injustice just because I'm a Christian and that's what the Bible tells me to do, and it doesn't help me at all. I have nothing to gain from it. And so, again, the portrayal of CRT would say the more radical thing that that white people only do something on behalf of a minority because it benefits them. Would there be some radical CRT people that would say that? Certainly, absolutely. But is the mainstream of CRT saying that? That's not actually true. Number four, critical race theory says racism intersects with other aspects of a person's social identity, their class and gender, to create different modes of discrimination. So think about it. So if you are a minority because of your race in America, and you also speak a different language, you also come from a different country, maybe you're an immigrant, you're female, maybe a single mom. All of those different things intersect with race to develop a person's social identity and to create different modes of discrimination. So a person that can't speak the language is going to have more obstacles to overcome than a person that does speak the language. So it just speaks like intersectionality, that these things intersect together. The representation of CRT would say discrimination and victimization are all that matters. And obviously, this point, which is a perfectly legitimate point, can be taken to an extreme where all we try to do is find out who's being discriminated against, who's a victim, and that's all we want people to think about, and that's not healthy, obviously. But it's also not healthy to not recognize that people are dealing with different obstacles based on their own experiences, and we should try to come alongside of that. And so that's the fourth thing, intersectionality. And then the fifth part of CRT is the idea that the marginalized must tell their stories of encountering racism for progress to occur. It's what we call storytelling, the importance of people speaking out and saying, here's what I'm going through, here's what happened to me. And that's an important way for racial healing. And according to CRT, it's also an important way to make the dominant group aware of their own problems, which they might not be aware of. Okay? The representation of it is that only the stories of the marginalized matter. In other words, that white people's stories or other races, whatever the dominant group is, their stories don't matter. All that matters is the story of the person of this particular group who is experiencing racism. And obviously, if that's true, that's very unhealthy. But it's not true to say that a person's story matters. That means that no one else's story matters either. I think it's fair to say everybody's story matters. That's certainly what Christianity would teach us. Okay, so that's the conversation that we wanted to accomplish in class. If you notice, again, when you're done here with this conversation, if you take a look in Canvas and you look at the first module, you'll see that discussion 1.1 is there. You'll need to go and complete the assignment that we talked about, introduce yourself, do all the things associated with that. I will then come in and grade that. And then for Thursday's class, you are to read the first chapter, at least. Now, I suggest you read more of Douglass because you're going to have to read this whole book by next Tuesday. So I suggest you read way more of Douglass than just the first chapter. But what you're going to have to do for Thursday is write the major themes, what you perceive to be the major themes of chapter 1 for that discussion. So there's a discussion due on Thursday. Again, the notes for Thursday's class are there. There's the video lecture. Again, that's optional to look at. That goes a little deeper into the conversation of things that we don't have time to discuss. And then always you'll see anything I used in class will be there in the module as teaching slides. And so if you want to go back through the slides that I used in class and see them, that's where you'll find that in the teaching slides. So again, the way to communicate with me is through text or a phone call. And if you have any concerns or questions or anything you need clarified, feel free to give me a call and I will be happy to answer your questions. And for anybody that's unable to make Thursday's class, I will do the same thing that I did here for Thursday's class and put the same teaching slide video up as well, which has audio with it. So again, thanks for joining me. Let me know if you have any questions. I hope you have a great day.